se burla de las autoridades mexicanas al escaparse nuevamente de
One of the world's richest, most notorious drug kingpins broke out of prison.
Tenemos que nos ha funcionado mucho, que es el Chapo Bros.
Mafia nueva, Sinaloense, pura plebada de arranque.
Imagine you get called for jury duty. The case for which you are summoned involves the defendant Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, also known as El Chapo.
I'm going to tell you about how the drug war in Mexico began and who was boss.
What you just saw were various examples of the way narco culture is showcased in America, whether that be through the news, the apparel industry, music, podcasts, or hit Netflix shows. One thing is clear: it's become more popular than ever before. But why? In order to understand how narco culture has gained its popularity, we have to take a look at where it all began. Narco culture began in Sinaloa, a rural countryside area located in Mexico, which very quickly became the capital of drug trafficking. We have to thank the Spanish for introducing cannabis to Mexico when they first arrived. And it didn't take long before there was a huge demand from the U.S. It was in the 1970s that the term narco culture was coined, and around this time we saw the first depictions of narco lifestyle through zany B-grade films like La Banda del Carro Rojo in 1978, El Traficante in 1983, and La Camioneta Gris in 1990, which were usually inspired by narcocorridos from norteña bands like Los Tigres del Norte and funded by drug traffickers themselves. These films follow the lives of people who have joined narco life due to necessity, love, and family obligation. From the explosive car crashes to the loads of cash seen on screen, these films do a great job of glamorizing narco culture. And with little representation of Latinx figures at the time, many individuals began to see them as idols.
When you see stuff with narcos especially, you have this increased interest in Escobar as like a mythical person, right? And the show shows all the things that he did, the really violent, horrible things, as really glamorous. He's like dangerous, he's an anti-hero. When he was like a real person who ended a lot of lives and caused so much conflict in Colombia and throughout Latin America because that wasn't contained. So I think the danger that you have with especially American media when it comes to that topic is that people get a very one-sided perspective of this man who is like impressive and like glamorous and interesting instead of seeing him as like really a monster, right? Because what he did was awful.
Fast forward a few decades and narco culture has made its way into mainstream media in films like Sicario, Miss Vala, Narcocultura, and many more. The success of these films can be credited to the massive media coverage of El Chapo and La Barbie on well-known news outlets. These news outlets cover the raids, captures, and trials, but forget to mention the narratives of the civilians affected by drug trafficking every day.
People who were not like in positions of power when this was happening, I think is definitely like lacking. A lot of people have seen the movie like Maria Full of Grace, or I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's like a pretty like famous Colombian movie about a girl who becomes a drug mule in order to come to America, right? And I feel like that, even though like that's kind of held up as like this is like the Colombian movie, you know what I mean? But even that, like narratives like that aren't seen that much when we talk about narco culture, because these are people without any like political power or like financial power or anything. And so not only are they being like disadvantaged from a media standpoint in that like they don't get their own stories in general, but their perspective on this issue is so often overlooked for the people who have money, who have like all these privileges, right?
Younger viewers and listeners are one of the most vulnerable audiences of this genre.
creo yo que cuando lo escuchan, por un momento se cree en esa persona, ¿no? Se cree el protagonista de esa historia. Cita a la juventud a probar, que quiere tener como un minuto de fama.
Es algo normal y era como tu superhéroe. Porque creces en el barrio y tus superhéroes son aquel que acaba de salir de la correccional, del reclusorio, de la penitenciaría, de los anexos y cuentan sus patoaventuras y tú vienes a creer que son superhéroes.
We also have to take a look at other informative means of communication. For example, music. This is a narco corrido, or a ballad of the Mexican cartel. The lyrics of narco corridos describe the lives of drug traffickers. Musicians like El Commander have gained a large following and have sold out venues in Mexico and the US. But Mexico has banned these concerts due to the violent acts that break out during the shows. This large audience following is also seen on Instagram and within the apparel industry.
I think social media, like in general, plays a huge role in deciding what's popular and like setting trends, you know what I mean, like what people are talking about and everything. Social media is so focused on like what's popular, what's now, what's new, you know? It definitely gives rise to like, for people to consider first like what looks good and what feels good instead of like being critically thinking like, who is this disserving?
One notable trait that is seen among followers of these icons is clothing.
Tenemos este que nos ha funcionado mucho, que es el Chapo Bros. Próximamente la tercera fuga.
But isn't representation of the Latinx community on mainstream media good? What's the problem? The problem lies within the narratives that are told versus those that are not.
And a lot of the media that talks about that era and that conflict, a lot of it is either told from the perspective of drug cartels and these people in power like Escobar, or politicians. So like Narcos, for example, is told from the perspective of both Escobar and also the US DEA officers who are trying to extradite him. But it's really, really rare for media to talk about that conflict from the perspective of like civilians, which were arguably like the people who were the most affected, innocent civilians who weren't a part of the trade, but were either brought into it due to poverty or whose lives were just put in danger by like the conflict that often happened in public areas. So like those positions of power that those stories are told from can really warp it, either like glamorize it or turn it into something that's really skewed.
Drug traffickers like El Chapo and Pablo Escobar were also seen as positive figures by many individuals.
The exact same thing happened with Escobar, right? Where when he was arrested and there was all of this conflict both from Colombian politicians and American politicians trying to get him arrested, trying to bring discipline to him. A lot of the really poverty-stricken areas that he helped, because he funneled a lot of money into infrastructure, schooling, food to a lot of these really poor communities, poor rural communities, were like outraged that their Robin Hood is being disciplined. And I think that speaks a lot to like the inadequacies of like government, right? That people who are so underprivileged have to rely on like drug lords in order for them to get their basic needs, right? It's like you can't blame the people who are starving, who don't have infrastructure or food or schooling, by defending these people who are doing what the government should be doing, right? So it's definitely a complicated issue.
These shows are representative of the Latinx community, but also exclude a lot of narratives. For individuals who have no previous knowledge or exposure to the Latinx community, seeing this narrative of narcos reiterated in media could actually damage the way they perceive it. There has to be a shift in the way we view drug traffickers and the way it's portrayed.
I don't think it's ever going to stop, like this production of media that's about narco wars. But if it is to continue, I think that like diversity of perspective is like really vital.
The popularization of narco culture, as you have seen throughout this video, can not only be tracked back to one form of communication, whether that be TV, the clothing apparel, The lives of narcos are interesting and make great entertainment, but we also have to start critiquing its effects on the Latinx community, the way it's viewed, and why has it become so popular in the United States.